The air had an inorganic cleanliness to it, the kind unique to the mansions of Atherton, California. The smell of triple-filtered air, expensive minimalist fragrances, and the cold, thin scent of money itself. Standing in this temple of glass and concrete, Eleanor, Ellie Vance felt like a piece of obsolete software about to be deleted. Julian Croft, her fiancé, or rather, her ex-fiancé, was leaning against his six-figure Italian sofa. He was impeccably handsome, every strand of hair looking as if it had been placed on his forehead by precise calculation. He looked at her the way one might examine a line of inelegant code. "The problem isn't entirely you, Ellie," Julian began, his voice as smooth as silk, but with the sharpness of a blade. "It's me. I've changed. I was first drawn to you because of your purity. The Ivy League art history degree, the passion for Botticelli, that ethereal quality. It was charming, like an undiscovered piece of art." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the tight Balenciaga dress she wore, the one he'd made her by just last month. "But it's been 5 years, and I've personally polished and upgraded you. I brought you into this circle, taught you the rules of engagement, made you the most dazzling woman at every party. You did an excellent job," he said, a hint of approval in his tone, as if praising a successful product. "But now I find I miss the original version." His gaze shifted to the other side of the sofa. A girl sat there, dressed in a simple white t-shirt and jeans, with almost no makeup on. Haley Sutton, a Stanford intern, with eyes as clear as a rare blue sky in Silicon Valley. She looked just like Ellie had 5 years ago. Ellie's blood ran cold. For the past 5 years, she had been a dutiful programmer, constantly modifying her own source code to meet Julian's demands. He said she was too quiet, so she learned to be the life of the party. He said she dressed too conservatively, so she stuffed her closet with avant-garde designer brands. He said she should be more ambitious, so she abandoned her paintbrushes and became the perfect arm candy in his social circle. She thought it was love, assimilation. Now she understood. It was just a long, asymmetrical venture capital investment, and she, along with everything she had given him, had become a non-performing asset. "Look at you now." Julian's voice lost its last trace of warmth. "You're too loud, Ellie. The scent of your perfume, your laughter at parties, the selfies with those so-called friends I despise. It's all too much, too deliberate." He frowned in disgust. "You're like an application with feature bloat, unwieldy, slow, and taking up too much memory." Haley shot Ellie a timid glance, as if she were the victim. "Julian, don't say that," she whispered, every syllable oozing innocence. "No, I have to be clear," Julian said, grabbing Haley's hand and lacing their fingers together, as if showing off a new acquisition. "I need something clean, simple. Haley makes me feel calm. Being with her is effortless. That's an efficient relationship." "An efficient relationship?" Ellie finally found her voice, dry and hoarse. 5 years, Julian. We were engaged." She held out her hand, where the priceless diamond ring he had personally designed pricked her eyes under the light. "An engagement is just a beta test, Ellie. And clearly, we didn't pass." He stood and walked over to her, his movements devoid of any hesitation. He gently took her hand, not to comfort her, but to remove the ring. "I'll have my assistant handle the follow-up. The house, the cars, and your trust fund. I'll give you a generous severance package. After all, you were a project for the Croft Group." He placed the ring on the coffee table, where it made a crisp, final sound. Then, without a backward glance, he led Haley away, leaving Ellie in a vast, empty living room thick with the stench of failure. The door closed silently. In that moment, Ellie felt abandoned by the entire world. The headlines about them, the sweet photos on tech blogs, the loving hashtags on social media, they all instantly became evidence of her mockery. She, Eleanor Vance, Silicon Valley's most famous future princess, had become a joke overnight. A failed project, personally discontinued by its founder. When she returned to her family's home in Palo Alto, her father, Richard Vance, was waiting for her. The house, once full of hope and innovation, now shared the same air of decay as Vance Technologies. Her father sat in his study, a glass of whiskey before him instead of documents. "He dumped you," Richard stated, not a question but a fact. His eyes, sharp as a vulture's, scanned every detail of her face, searching for any exploitable value. Ellie didn't answer, sinking exhaustedly into a chair. I told you beauty and obedience weren't enough. Richard's voice rose, filled with a caustic fury. Did you think a man like Julian Croft would marry a pretty vase who only knows how to paint? I told you to lock him down for the Vance family. Look at you, 5 years. You wasted 5 whole years and still got kicked to the curb. Now the whole valley is laughing at us. It wasn't my fault. Ellie screamed back. He's the one who made me that way. I don't care whose fault it is. Richard slammed his hand on the desk, the amber liquid in his glass sloshing violently. The fact is, we're finished. The board is voting next week, and without a new injection of capital, Vance Technologies will go bankrupt. And you, my only daughter, my biggest investment, have failed. Ellie closed her eyes, her father's words piercing her heart like icicles. She knew the family company was in trouble, but she hadn't realized it was on the brink of collapse. Richard looked at her despairing face, and his tone suddenly softened, becoming as cold and seductive as a snake's hiss. But there might be one more chance. A chance to save us all. He took a file from a drawer and pushed it in front of Ellie. On the cover was a name she had never heard. Blackwood. Alistair Blackwood. Richard said the name with a trace of reverence. A New York financial titan, true old money. His influence runs much deeper than the Croft families. And he's interested in you. Ellie's eyes shot open as she stared at her father in disbelief. What do you mean? I mean a marriage alliance. A strategic merger that can save Vance Technologies. Richard's eyes gleamed with a fanatical light. He's willing to inject $50 million for a 40% stake in the company, on the condition that you marry him. Are you insane? I don't even know him. That doesn't matter. What matters is that he knows you. Richard leaned forward, his voice a low hiss. I know this isn't fair to you, Ellie, but think of your brother and sister. Their tuition in England, their future. Without Vance Technologies, they're nothing. Can you bear to see them kicked out of school, working dead-end jobs for the rest of their lives? Her siblings were Ellie's only weakness. She could neglect herself, but not them. Why me? Ellie's voice trembled that a flicker of something unnatural crossed Richard's face as he avoided her gaze. I don't know. Maybe he saw your picture. Maybe he heard the rumors. Who can figure out those eccentric New York tycoons? Rumor has it he had an accident a few years ago and is now confined to a wheelchair, and his temperament has become very volatile. But so what? You just have to be his wife, play your part. How is that any different from what you did for Julian? Different? Ellie wanted to laugh. It was completely different. She had once loved Julian, or at least she thought she had. Now, she was to be sold like property to a tyrannical, allegedly disabled man she knew nothing about. I'll give you 3 days to think about it, Richard said, standing to look down on her. In 3 days, Blackwood's lawyer will be here. You can either sign this agreement and save your family, or you can watch us all go down in flames. The choice is yours. The study door closed. Ellie sat alone in the darkness, feeling like a moth trapped in the center of a spider's web. She was being moved from one cage to another, darker and more unknown. Her life, it seemed, had never belonged to her. For the next 3 days, Ellie locked herself in her room. She didn't cry. The tears seemed to have run dry the moment Julian abandoned her. She moved like a ghost through her room, touching the relics that marked 5 years of her youth. Her closet was filled with clothes Julian had chosen for her, each one priceless, each one like a costume reminding her of the role she had played. She took them down, one by one, and threw them on the floor, creating a lavish tomb that on her vanity sat various pieces of jewelry. She opened a massive, custom-goyered jewelry case, a birthday gift from Julian he had called her treasure chest. 9 drawers were filled with diamonds, sapphires, emeralds. He had once laughed and said he wanted to fill her with the finest things in the world. Now it seemed he just wanted to use these cold stones to silence all her true thoughts and feelings. In a small velvet pouch in the bottom drawer, she found something else. It wasn't jewelry, but a yellowed, creased card. It was the business card from the first company Julian's father had founded, and on the back, in a childish script, was a single line. One favor, no questions asked. Julian. It was from when they were 12. She had saved him at a wilderness summer camp when he got lost and twisted his ankle. To thank her, he had pulled this startup memento, which his father treasured, from his pocket and solemnly wrote his promise. You can use this for anything. the young Julian had said with a serious face. Anything I can do. Ellie had kept it all this time. During the worst moments of Julian's cold emotional abuse, she had thought about using this card to ask for a marriage commitment. But in the end, she didn't. The last shred of pride in her bones wouldn't allow her to use a childhood kindness to beg for a grown man's pity. She looked at the card and suddenly laughed. The sound was soft, but filled with a sense of finality. 3 days later, she walked out of her room, her face pale, but her eyes unnervingly calm. She went to her father and said, "I agree." A look of immense relief washed over Richard's face. Before Blackwood's lawyer arrived, Ellie did one thing. She contacted Julian's assistant, Mark. "There are some things that need to be returned to Mr. Croft," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "They are very valuable. Please ensure they are delivered to him personally." Mark was clearly impatient on the other end of the line, probably thinking this was another one of her ploys to get back together. "Miss Vance, I'd advise you not to waste your time. Mr. Croft is about to get engaged to Miss Sutton. It's better for everyone if we all just move on." Ellie didn't explain. She simply handed over the enormous jewelry case and the small card to the movers who came to pick them up. She imagined Julian's expression when he saw these things. Would he feel a flicker of guilt, or would he just think she had finally gotten the hint and made her exit? Whatever it was, it no longer had anything to do with her. On the flight to New York, Ellie watched the lights of Silicon Valley recede below, blurring into a sea of light. Her life, like this plane, was heading into completely unknown territory. She closed her eyes and felt a strange sense of relief. The heavy shackles named Julian Croft finally seemed to be unlocked. Even if what awaited her was another, more terrifying abyss. Alistair Blackwood's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a pre-war building on Central Park West. When Ellie stepped out of the private elevator, she was met by a suffocating silence and an overwhelming, old-world grandeur. There was none of Silicon Valley's transparent, showy modernity. In its place were dark mahogany wall panels, heavy Persian rugs, and what appeared to be original Rothkos and de Koonings on the walls. The air smelled of leather, old books, and a faint hint of cigar smoke. A well-dressed, expressionless butler led her down a long corridor to a study overlooking the entirety of Central Park. And then she saw Alistair Blackwood. He sat in a massive wheelchair that looked more like a throne, a soft cashmere blanket covering his legs. He wore a perfectly tailored dark gray suit, the collar of his white shirt impeccable. He was younger and more handsome than in the photos, but it was a handsomeness that carried a weathered sharpness. His black hair was neatly combed, but his deep-set eyes held the alertness of a predator. Those eyes, as black as an abyss, were fixed on her. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. The rumors said he was volatile, and now she believed them completely. The powerful and dangerous aura he exuded made her want to turn and flee. She took a deep breath and forced herself to walk forward. According to the agreement, she was his wife now. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice a little tight. He didn't answer immediately, his probing eyes appraising her from head to toe. His gaze held no lust. It was more like a strategist assessing the performance of a new weapon. "Miss Vance," he finally spoke, his voice low and raspy, with a strange magnetism that contrasted sharply with his dangerous appearance. "Or, I suppose I should call you Mrs. Blackwood now." "Whatever you prefer," Ellie said, straightening her back. Refusing to show weakness, he seemed slightly surprised by her response, the corner of his mouth twitching into a barely perceptible smirk before quickly vanishing. "Sit," he said, gesturing to an antique armchair opposite him. Ellie sat, feeling like a prisoner on trial. "You've seen the agreement. Your father is very efficient," Alistair said flatly. "The funds for Vance Technologies were transferred this afternoon. Your brother and sister can now complete their studies without worry." Ellie's heart eased slightly. This was the only reason she had sold herself. "Thank you. This is a transaction, Vance." "Eleanor," he corrected himself, seeming to savor her name on his tongue. "You fulfill your part, and I fulfill mine. It's simple. And what is my part? To be my wife. To appear at the occasions that require your presence. To maintain the facade of a happy marriage to the outside world. Beyond that, you have complete freedom." He maneuvered his wheelchair closer. Ellie could smell the clean scent of soap and a faint trace of tobacco on him. "You will not be required to fulfill other wifely duties," he said bluntly, his eyes unblinking. You've heard about my physical condition, I presume. I have no interest in those things. Ellie's cheeks flushed. She hadn't expected him to be so direct, which gave her a strange, absurd sense of being respected. I'm tired, she said in a low voice. The long flight and immense mental stress had brought her to the brink of collapse. Alistair looked at her pale face and the dark circles under her eyes, silent for a moment. The butler will show you to your room. It's next to mine. If you need anything, you can call him at any time. He paused, then added, This is your home now, Eleanor. At least, for the duration of the agreement. Try to relax a little. It was the first comforting thing she had heard from him. Ellie's room was astonishingly large, with a terrace overlooking the park. The decor was neutral and elegant, without any personal touches, like a top-tier hotel suite. She took a shower, changed into her pajamas, and laid down on the cool, soft expanse of the bed. The New York nightscape spread out beneath her like a glittering galaxy. But she felt like a lone star, cast into an unknown cosmos. She thought of Silicon Valley, of Julian. There was no love, but at least there was hate. Here, she felt nothing, only a vast, empty void of uncertainty. She didn't know when she fell asleep, but she slept deeply, dreamlessly. It was the most peaceful night's sleep she'd had in 5 years. The next morning, Ellie awoke to sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She left her room to find Alistair already in the dining room, a black coffee and the Wall Street Journal in front of him. Good morning, he said without looking up. Good morning, Ellie replied, taking the seat opposite him. I'm going to the office today. You can spend your time as you wish. This is for you, he said, pulling a black credit card from his pocket and sliding it across the table to her. There's no limit. Buy yourself something you like, clothes, jewelry, or art supplies. At the mention of art supplies, he finally looked up at her. His gaze was deep, as if it could see through the years of her facade to the real, art-loving self hidden within. Ellie's heart jolted. Julian never mentioned her painting. In his eyes, it was a waste of time, a hobby that generated no commercial value. I don't need your money, she said, pushing the card back. This isn't money for you. Alistair's tone was non-negotiable. It's Mrs. Blackwood's wardrobe budget. You need to look like my wife. I don't want to see you at next week's charity gala wearing those overly avant-garde clothes you brought from Silicon Valley. His words held a subtle, mocking edge. Ellie felt offended but couldn't argue. He was right. She needed a new set of costumes to play this new role. She took the card. After Alistair left, the entire penthouse fell into absolute silence, leaving Ellie alone. For the first time, she had the time and the inclination to examine the place that was to become the backdrop of her life. She wandered through the apartment as if exploring a museum. The priceless art on the walls, the rare first editions on the shelves, everything spoke to the deep-rooted legacy of his family. In a corner of the study, she discovered a small art studio. Inside were a new easel, brushes of all sizes, and a whole wall of top-brand paints, as if it had been carefully prepared for someone. Ellie stood in the middle of the studio for a long time, motionless. How long had it been since she'd smelled the mixture of turpentine and oil paint? She reached out, her fingers brushing against a blank canvas, feeling its faint, rough texture. A long-suppressed desire began to grow wildly from the depths of her heart, like a vine. That afternoon, she didn't go shopping on Fifth Avenue. Instead, she walked into the studio. She didn't paint grand, profound subjects. She simply followed her instincts, using her brush and colors to pour out the chaos, fear, and the tiny, faint spark of hope from the past few days onto the canvas. By the time she made her final brushstroke, it was already dark. She realized she had been in there for a full 8 hours, without eating or drinking, yet she felt no fatigue. Instead, she felt a sense of purification, of her soul returning to her body. She heard the sound of a wheelchair rolling toward the doorway. Alistair was back. He stopped at the entrance of the studio, looking at her standing before the easel and at the painting, with its intense colors and wild brushstrokes. The canvas depicted a chaotic, stormy sky, but a faint, golden light pierced through the darkest clouds. It seems you found something more interesting than shopping, he said, his voice unreadable. Ellie felt a pang of anxiety, instinctively wanting to shield the painting with her body. This was her most private, most vulnerable inner world, and she didn't want anyone to see it, especially not this man who was her husband in name only. But Alistair didn't come any closer. He just looked at the painting quietly for a long time, then said, "Dinner is ready." During dinner, the two remained silent, but Ellie felt the atmosphere was somehow different. Alistair was no longer as distant as he had been the day before. His gaze would occasionally land on her, filled with a complex emotion she couldn't decipher. "Next week's charity gala," he said, breaking the silence as he wiped his mouth with a napkin. "It's hosted by the Museum of Modern Art. As my wife, you'll need to accompany me." "Okay. You'll need a gown. I've already arranged for a stylist to come tomorrow." "Okay. There will be a lot of people, and reporters too. They'll be curious about you. No matter what they ask, you just need to smile and say you're very happy." He looked at her, his eyes sharp. "Can you do that, Eleanor?" Ellie gripped her fork tighter. Pretending to be happy was what she had been doing for the past 5 years. She thought she could probably do it very well. "I can," she replied, nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. Good. That week, Ellie lived a strange, secluded life. Stylists and makeup artists flowed in and out of the apartment, preparing her for the gala. Alistair left early and came home late every day. They barely spoke, except for a few necessary words at dinner. But Ellie didn't find it unbearable. She spent all her time in the studio. Painting calmed her. Each brushstroke felt like she was rebuilding her own world. She was no longer Julian Croft's accessory, nor was she Richard Vance's bargaining chip. In front of the canvas, she was just Eleanor Vance that on the night of the charity gala, Ellie wore a black velvet Oscar de la Renta gown that Alistair had personally selected. The dress was classic and elegant, making her skin look as white as snow and giving her a noble air. She looked at herself in the mirror and felt like a stranger. This was no longer the Silicon Valley party girl trying to attract attention with edgy, revealing outfits, but a serene woman with an air of mystery. Alistair was waiting for her downstairs. He had changed into a formal black tuxedo, and even in his wheelchair, his powerful aura was undiminished. When he saw Ellie descending the stairs, a flash of undisguised awe crossed his deep eyes. "Beautiful." He complimented her, his voice sincere that it was the first time he had praised her. Ellie's heart began to beat uncontrollably fast. The gala was held at the MoMA, and nearly all of New York's top socialites were in attendance. When Alistair Blackwood appeared with his new wife, they instantly became the center of attention. Countless gazes, curious, probing, jealous, hit Ellie like spotlights. She instinctively clutched her handbag tighter, but just then, Alistair covered her hand with his. His palm was large and warm, possessing a reassuring strength. "Don't be afraid," he whispered in her ear. "You just need to stand by my side." Throughout the evening, Ellie played the role of Mrs. Blackwood like a well-trained actress. She smiled elegantly, handling all sorts of overt and subtle inquiries. People were intensely curious about the woman who had suddenly appeared and married New York's most mysterious tycoon. "Mrs. Blackwood, how did you and Alistair meet?" a bejeweled socialite asked. "We met at an art exhibition," Ellie answered calmly, using the story they had prepared beforehand. "We both have a great interest in the works of Francis Bacon." Her answer was flawless, leaving those trying to dig for gossip empty-handed. She could feel Alistair's presence beside her, like an invisible shield warding off most of the malice. Though he was silent, wherever he paused, a center of power naturally formed around him, and no one dared to offend him lightly. Halfway through the gala, Ellie excused herself to the restroom, temporarily escaping the suffocating social scene. As she was fixing her makeup in front of the mirror, she overheard two women talking. "So that's Alistair Blackwood's new wife? She doesn't look like much. I heard she's from Silicon Valley, got dumped by that Croft heir." "I know, right? A woman who gets kicked out the door and then latches onto Blackwood in the blink of an eye. Who knows what tricks she used? I bet Alistair was duped. In his condition, he probably just needs a woman to take care of him and be a decoration. She'll keep it down." But seriously, being married to a cripple, no matter how rich he is, must be a lonely life, right? The malicious words stung Ellie's ears like needles. She knew gossip was the norm in high society, but when these words were tied to Alistair, she felt a strange surge of anger. That man, though only her husband by agreement, had been the only person to give her respect and space this past month. He didn't deserve to be talked about with such contempt. Ellie pushed the door open and walked out. The two women saw her. Their faces changed, and they immediately fell silent, awkwardly turning to leave. Ellie ignored them and walked straight back to the ballroom. When she returned to Alistair's side, she found him talking to a man she recognized, Julian Croft. What was he doing here? Ellie's heart clenched instantly. Julian saw her too. The expression on his face shifted from the surprise of seeing an acquaintance to a complex mix of possessiveness and contempt. It was as if he were saying, "See, even if you run to New York, you can't escape me." Ellie? What a coincidence. Julian's tone was flippant, as if they had just bumped into each other at some party. He ignored Alistair beside her and spoke directly to her. "Why didn't you tell me you were in New York? This look is nice, much better taste than before." His every word was a reminder of her humiliating past and their unequal relationship. Ellie's face hardened. She didn't answer, instead linking her arm through Alistair's. It was a subconscious gesture, seeking protection and declaring her allegiance. Alistair felt her stiffen. He turned his head, his deep gaze sweeping over Julian's face before landing on Ellie's with a questioning look. "And this is?" Alistair began, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. Before Ellie could answer, Julian cut in. "Julian Croft. Ellie and I are old friends." He deliberately emphasized the words, "old friends." "Mr. Croft." Alistair nodded, his tone cool. "I've heard of you. The rising star of Silicon Valley. A pleasure to meet you." He extended his hand but remained seated in his wheelchair, forcing Julian to bend slightly to shake it. It was a small but powerful gesture. Julian clearly felt it. The smile on his face froze for a second, but he shook the hand anyway. "Mr. Blackwood, a pleasure. I never expected to see you here. And I certainly never expected Ellie to be your date." "She is not my date," Alistair corrected him calmly, while his other hand gently patted the back of Ellie's hand that was linked with his, as if soothing a frightened bird. "She is my wife." Those three words hit Julian like a bombshell. The color drained from his face as he looked from Ellie to Alistair in disbelief. "What? You're married?" "Yes." Ellie finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. She met Julian's shocked gaze and, for the first time, found that she could face him with such calmness. The man who once made her heart race, who had made her feel as small as dust, now looked so pathetic. "When? What?" Julian's voice turned sharp with shock. He couldn't accept it. The woman he had discarded like trash, the woman he thought would come crying and begging for him back. How could she have married someone else in such a short time? And not just anyone, but Alistair Blackwood. "I don't believe that's any of your business, Mr. Croft." Alistair's voice grew cold. He turned his wheelchair slightly, shielding Ellie behind him. "My wife is tired. If you'll excuse us." With that, he calmly guided Ellie away from the dumbfounded Julian. Throughout the entire exchange, Ellie could feel Alistair's hand holding hers, steady and strong. She glanced back and saw Julian still frozen in place, like a statue struck by lightning. People around him were pointing and whispering. In that moment, Ellie didn't feel the thrill of revenge, only a complete and utter sense of release from the bottom of her heart. The story of her and Julian Croft had finally, in front of everyone, reached its conclusion. Back at the penthouse, the atmosphere was a bit tense. Ellie slipped off her heels, her bare feet cold against the marble floor. "Thank you for tonight," she said to Alistair. "Thank me for what?" he asked, his back to her as he poured a glass of brandy. "Thank you for saving me back there." He turned, handing one of the glasses to her. "I was just protecting my property. Mrs. Blackwood's reputation is my reputation." His words were still businesslike, but Ellie saw a different emotion in his deep eyes. She took the glass and gently clinked it against his. "Well, thank you anyway." They drank in silence. Outside, the New York night was as dazzling as ever. "So, that was Julian Croft," Alistair said suddenly. "Yes." "Did you love him?" he asked directly. Ellie froze. She thought for a long moment, then shook her head. "I don't know. I used to think I did. But looking back now, it was probably more of a dependency and habit. Like an addiction I couldn't quit. And he was my dealer." Alistair looked at her, his gaze softening slightly. "And now you've quit." "Yes." Ellie smiled, her first genuine, relaxed smile since arriving in New York. "I've quit." After that night, A subtle change occurred between them. They still maintained their distance, but they were no longer as detached as before. Alistair seemed busier, often working late into the night in his study. Ellie, meanwhile, completely immersed herself in her world of art. The studio became her sanctuary. She painted a lot, her style gradually shifting from its initial oppression and chaos to something brighter and more expansive. She painted the early morning mist in Central Park, the sunsets over the Hudson River, the silent, seemingly alive art pieces in the apartment. She never painted Alistair. She didn't dare. The man was too complex, like an iceberg. What she saw was only the tip above the water. As for Julian Croft, he had completely vanished from her life. She occasionally saw news about him in gossip columns. She heard his engagement party with Haley Sutton had been postponed indefinitely. She heard that after his outburst at the MoMA Gala, he had become a laughingstock in their circle. She also heard that Croft's company stock had been experiencing some unusual fluctuations recently. Ellie was indifferent to all of it. Everything about Silicon Valley felt as distant as a past life, until one day, Mark, Julian's former assistant, called her Miss Vance. Mark's voice sounded dejected. "I'm sorry to bother you. I've been fired." Ellie was a little surprised. "Why?" Because of that jewelry case." Mark's voice was laced with fear. "Mr. Croft saw the things you returned that day. He opened the case, and then he just lost it. He called me in, asking about the card, asking what you said when you returned everything. He's never been that out of control." Ellie's heart sank. That card. Had he finally remembered? He said you couldn't have just let it go, that you must be playing some kind of hard-to-get game. He told me to call you, to tell you to come see him immediately. He said if you didn't, you would regret it. And then, I didn't call. I didn't think he was in his right mind. The next day, he fired me." Mark sighed. "Miss Vance, I don't know what happened between you two. But Mr. Croft right now, he's not well. It's like he's gone mad. He's looking for you everywhere, contacting all your friends. You should be careful." After hanging up, Ellie couldn't calm herself for a long time. Julian's reaction was completely beyond her expectations. She had thought he would toss her aside like an old toy and quickly move on with his new life. She never imagined her departure would make him lose control like this. This made her feel uneasy, not triumphant. And out of control, paranoid Julian Croft was far more dangerous than a cold-hearted one. She walked to the door of the study. Alistair was inside on the phone. His tone was cold, as if he were dealing with a difficult matter. "I don't care what methods you use. I want to see Croft's stock drop another 5 points within 3 days. Also, make a list of all the investors he's been in contact with recently. I want to know every card he's holding." Ellie's heart leaped. Was he going after Julian? She silently retreated. That evening, when Alistair came out of his study, he looked tired. Ellie poured him a glass of water. "Is it busy at the company?" she asked casually. Some acquisition deals recently," he said, taking the water and drinking it in one gulp. Ellie watched him, hesitating for a moment before deciding to speak. "Julian, is he in some kind of trouble?" Alistair put down the glass and looked up, his black eyes deep and unreadable in the light. "Why do you ask?" "I've heard some rumors." "Business is war, Eleanor." His tone was flat. "Some win, some lose." Mr. Croft's methods were too reckless. It was only a matter of time before he ran into trouble. His answer was seamless, but Ellie knew it wasn't that simple. The trouble at Croft's company had to be connected to him. Was he getting revenge for her? The thought threw her heart into turmoil. She couldn't tell if she should feel the warmth of being protected or the fear of being dragged into this dangerous corporate warfare. "Don't overthink it," Alistair said, seeming to see through her. "You just focus on your painting. I'll handle things out here." He reached out and, for the first time, gently touched her cheek. His fingertips were a little cool, but the gesture was tender. "You look so much better than when you first arrived," he said. "You have some color in your cheeks now." At that moment, Ellie's heart completely lost control. The days passed, and New York entered autumn. The leaves in Central Park began to turn yellow, and the weather grew cooler. Ellie's life was quiet and orderly. She spent long hours in her studio every day, and her artistic skills improved at a visible rate. A small gallery in New York took an interest in her work and invited her to participate in a group exhibition for young artists. It was the first time she would be publicly showing her work as the artist Eleanor Vance, not as someone's accessory. When Alistair found out, he said nothing, but simply had the butler place a file with all the information on the gallery on her desk. On the opening day of the exhibition, Alistair accompanied her. He remained silent and powerful, like her guardian angel, shielding her from all unnecessary disturbances. Ellie's paintings were hung in the most prominent position, and many people stopped to look, showing great interest in this newcomer with a unique style. That a famous art critic stood before her painting for a long time and then said to her, "Miss Vance, there is an astonishing vitality in your work, a power of rebirth from ruins. I look forward to seeing your future pieces." Ellie was so moved she could barely speak. It was the most wonderful compliment she had received in years. She turned to look at Alistair and found him gazing at her, his eyes holding a gentle smile she had never seen before. In that moment, she suddenly felt that marrying this man might not have been a tragedy, but rather a salvation. However, the peaceful days did not last long. An unexpected visitor shattered everything. That afternoon, Ellie was painting in her studio when the butler suddenly entered, his face grave. "Madam, there is a gentleman outside. He says his name is Julian Croft and insists on seeing you." Ellie's brush froze in midair. He had actually followed her to New York, found his way here. "Tell him I'm not here," Ellie said coldly. "We have already told him that, but he doesn't believe us. He says if you don't see him, he will wait downstairs indefinitely." Ellie frowned. She went to the window and lifted a corner of the curtain to look down. Sure enough, a familiar Maybach was parked at the building's entrance, and Julian was leaning against the car, stubbornly staring up at the building. He looked much more haggard, his former air of arrogance gone, replaced by a gloomy, obsessive aura. Ellie felt a wave of annoyance. This man was like a piece of gum you couldn't scrape off your shoe. "Let him wait," she said to the butler, dropping the curtain. Julian really did wait downstairs for the entire afternoon. He was still there when Alistair came home after dark. His car pulled up next to the Maybach, and the two men, one in his car and one outside, stared at each other through the windows for a long time. It was a silent, powder keg of a standoff. Finally, Alistair went upstairs. When he came in, his face was as dark as a sky before a storm. "He's still down there," he said to Ellie. "I know. Do you want to see him?" Ellie shook her head. "I don't want anything to do with him ever again." Alistair looked at her resolute expression, paused for a moment, then picked up the phone and dialed a number. "Security? There's an unwelcome individual at the front of the building. Deal with it. I don't want to see him on my property again." A few minutes later, a commotion erupted downstairs. When Ellie looked again, Julian was being escorted into his car by two large security guards and driven away in disgrace. Ellie breathed a sigh of relief, but a deeper sense of unease settled in her heart. She knew that, given Julian's personality, he would never give up so easily. Sure enough, a few days later, a much bigger storm arrived. That day, Ellie and Alistair were on their way to a friend's weekend party in the Hamptons. Just as their car entered the highway, Ellie noticed a vehicle behind them, following at a steady distance. "That car, has it been following us since we left the building?" Ellie asked the driver. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror and nodded. "Yes, madam." Ellie's heart leaped into her throat. She looked at Alistair beside her and saw that he too was watching the car, his eyes cold and sharp. "Lose him," Alistair ordered the driver. The driver floored it, trying to shake the tail. But the car behind them immediately sped up, sticking to them like a shadow. The two vehicles engaged in a heart-stopping chase on the highway to ATA curve. The car behind them suddenly rammed into their side. Bang! A deafening crash, and Ellie felt her body thrown by a massive force, then slammed back into her seat. The airbags deployed instantly as the car spun out of control and crashed into the guardrail in the last second before losing consciousness. Ellie felt Alistair shield her with his own body, holding her tightly in his arms. She smelled his familiar, reassuring scent, mixed with a hint of blood. When Ellie woke up again, she was in a strange room that smelled of disinfectant. A hospital. Her head throbbed, and she had a few cuts and bruises, but she wasn't seriously injured. She sat up immediately, frantically searching for Alistair. "Alistair, "Where's Alistair?" she asked, grabbing a nurse's arm. "You mean Mr. Blackwood?" He's in surgery," the nurse said with a sympathetic look. "Surgery? Is he badly hurt?" Ellie felt her blood run cold. "Yes, ma'am. He took a severe impact to his back protecting you. And his legs, the injuries were aggravated." Ellie's mind went blank. Ignoring the nurse's protests, she ran to the operating room door. The red "in surgery" sign burned into her heart like a branding iron. She leaned against the cold wall and slowly slid to the floor. Guilt and fear washed over her like a tidal wave. It was all because of her. If it weren't for her, Julian wouldn't have followed them to New York. They wouldn't have gotten into a car crash, and Alistair wouldn't be. She couldn't bear to think about it. She curled up in the corner, feeling, for the first time, a real, piercing heartache and fear for a man. She realized that, somewhere along the way, the silent man in the wheelchair had come to occupy a very important place in her heart. After what felt like an eternity, the operating room light finally went out. The doctor emerged. "How is he?" Ellie rushed forward immediately. The surgery was a success. "Mr. Blackwood is out of mortal danger." But, the doctor sighed. The old injury to his spine suffered a secondary trauma, and coupled with the nerve damage in his legs, "I'm afraid that in the future, he will truly never walk again." Ellie felt the world spin, nearly fainting. Alistair was wheeled out of surgery, his face as white as a sheet, still unconscious. Ellie held his cold hand, tears streaming silently down her face. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," she whispered over and over again in his ear. For the next few days, Ellie never left Alistair's bedside. She cleaned him, gave him water, and cared for him as if he were her most precious treasure. He was mostly asleep, and when he did wake, he would just look at her quietly, his expression complex. Meanwhile, the outside world had erupted over the car crash. Every media outlet was reporting that Julian Croft, out of jealousy, had deliberately caused the accident to murder Alistair Blackwood. The Croft company's stock plummeted, and Julian himself was taken into police custody for investigation. The once golden boy of Silicon Valley became a prisoner overnight. Richard Vance called her countless times, his voice filled with panic and fear, terrified that the Blackwood family's retaliation would extend to Vance Technologies. Ellie didn't answer a single call. All she cared about right now was Alistair. A week later, Alistair's condition had improved enough for him to speak. "Stop crying," he said in a hoarse voice, looking at her swollen eyes. "You look awful when you cry." But Ellie's tears only fell harder. "I'm sorry. It's all my fault. It has nothing to do with you," he said, shaking his head. "This was the path I chose myself." His words were cryptic, but Ellie didn't understand them at the time. "Your legs," she choked out, unable to continue. Alistair was silent. He stared at the ceiling for a long time before finally speaking slowly. "Maybe this is for the best. Now, I don't have to pretend anymore." "Pretend?" Ellie was stunned. Just then, the hospital room door opened. A man in a suit who looked like a lawyer walked in, followed by several uniformed police officers. "Mr. Blackwood," the lawyer said respectfully to Alistair. "Everything is taken care of. He has confessed." Alistair nodded. Then he looked at a bewildered Ellie, a hint of apology in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. There are some things I've been hiding from you." What happened next completely upended Ellie's world. The lawyer explained everything. It turned out that Alistair's so-called disability had been a sham from the very beginning. He did have an accident a few years ago, but the injuries weren't severe enough to leave him permanently paralyzed. His rival, an uncle who had been coveting the family business, assumed he was incapacitated and let his guard down. Alistair decided to play along, faking his disability while secretly gathering evidence to take his rival down in one fell swoop. And Julian Croft was just a pawn in this plan. Alistair had long predicted that Julian, given his personality, would do something crazy after learning Ellie had married him. He exploited Julian's paranoia and jealousy, setting up the car crash to draw out his uncle's forces and completely ruin Julian. "So, the crash was part of your plan?" Ellie stared at Alistair in disbelief. "My injuries, your surgery, it was all fake?" "The crash was real, but everything was within a controllable range. Your injuries were just superficial." Alistair looked at her. "As for me, I didn't need a minor surgery to take care of some old injuries. I just didn't expect it to worry you so much." He said it so lightly, but a wave of fear washed over Ellie. This man's mind was so meticulous, his methods so ruthless, it was terrifying. He had played everyone, including her. She felt a profound sense of powerlessness. She thought she had escaped one manipulator, only to fall into the hands of a grandmaster. Why me? She looked at him, the tears in her eyes gone, replaced by a cold disappointment. Why did you choose me to be your pawn? Alistair was silent. He looked at her, and for the first time, his eyes showed a fragile, almost painful emotion. Because, he began slowly, his voice low and raspy. Many years ago, at an art exhibition, I saw a girl. She was standing in front of her own painting, and she had a light in her eyes. The painting was of a field of ruins, but in those ruins, a single sunflower was blooming, facing the sun. Ellie's heart felt as if it were being squeezed by an invisible hand. Later, I looked for that girl everywhere. By the time I found her again, she had changed. The man beside her had extinguished the light in her eyes. She didn't paint anymore. The sunflower in her painting had withered. He looked at her and said, word by word, I chose you, not to be my pawn, but to help you bloom again. Ellie was completely stunned. She never could have imagined this was the truth. So, she asked, her voice trembling, you did all of this for me, just to, I love you, Eleanor. Alistair Blackwood, the man who held the fate of New York's financial world in his hands, the man feared by countless people, said the words he had hidden for so many years in the most direct, most clumsy way. From the first moment I saw you. Ellie's tears burst forth again. This time, not from sadness or fear, but from an overwhelming wave of emotion that was impossible to describe. It turned out that in a corner she knew nothing about, at a time when she thought she had been abandoned by the world, someone had been silently guarding the sunflower in her painting. She threw herself onto his hospital bed, hugging him tightly and crying her heart out, as if to release all the grievances and suppressions of the past years. Alistair hugged her back just as tightly. I'm sorry for dragging you into all this, he whispered in her ear. It won't happen again. From now on, I will only be your guardian, not your schemer. But, your legs. Ellie looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. Alistair suddenly smiled. Right in front of her, he slowly, deliberately, sat up in bed, and then he planted both feet on the floor and stood up. He was even taller and more imposing than she had imagined. They were never really broken, he said, holding out his hand to her, palm up. Now, my game is over. Mrs. Blackwood, would you be willing to start a new, real marriage with me? One that isn't a transaction. Ellie looked at him, the tears in her eyes turning into a brilliant smile. She placed her hand in his warm palm. I would. 3 months later, Alistair Blackwood and Eleanor Vance held a real wedding at their estate in the Hamptons, with only their closest friends and family in attendance. There were no media, no flashing lights. Only sunshine, a sea breeze, and the most sincere blessings. Ellie, wearing a simple and elegant wedding dress she had designed herself, held a bouquet of sunflowers as she walked step by step toward the man standing under an arch of roses. He looked at her, his eyes full of love and tenderness, as if she were the most precious treasure in the world. As they exchanged rings and shared a deep kiss, Ellie knew she had finally found where she belonged. Her sunflower, after enduring a long night and violent storms, was finally, once again, blooming freely toward the sun, and those who had once hurt her had all met their deserved ends. Julian Croft was sentenced to prison on multiple charges, and the Croft family was severely weakened, its former glory a thing of the past. Haley Sutton, having lost her backer, quickly disappeared from the social scene. And Ellie's father, Richard Vance, though he saved his company, forever lost his daughter's respect and love, but none of that mattered to Ellie anymore. She linked her arm with Alistair's, looked out at the blue ocean in the distance, and felt a sense of peace and happiness she had never known before. Her life, finally, was being written by her own hand, painted in the most brilliant colors.